Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes as we let the room fill in a little. So just hang tight for a bit. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to wait for the room to fill in a little. I'm going to repeat this a couple of times. So just hang back. We'll get started in a couple of minutes at about 12:03. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes, so just hang tight. We're just letting the room fill in for a little. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. I'm going to say this a couple of times, but we'll get started in a couple of minutes. We're just letting the room fill in as we wait for late arrivals, just for about one more minute. Thank you. Okay, so it's 12:03, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hey, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. My name is Herman Calderon. I hope you all can hear and see me. I'm the community manager at TechEquity Collaborative. So in my role, I get to engage with our supporters and our members through our event series, such as these, intro webinars, volunteer opportunities, and now I get to engage with you all here. So feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, but we won't answer any of those questions until the end. So a little bit about what we'll be talking about today. We'll talk about why Tech Equity Collaborative exists as an organization and how we got started. We'll talk about the key issues we've identified to help us understand the problems that need to be solved. And we'll talk about how we can take action to address our most pressing economic issues. But before we get into all that, I think it's important to talk about why we're here. So Tech Equity got started because some of its earliest founders and members saw the symptoms of growing inequity within their neighborhoods, and they understood that there was this perception that tech workers were the cause of all the problems around them. So they noticed things such as rising rents, increases in displacement, increases in traffic, and increases in people experiencing homelessness. And as they talked to others, they realized that they weren't alone in their concerns and that they, as tech workers, were uniquely positioned to help contribute to solutions that would address some of the inequities they were seeing around them. And especially now, in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that the affordability crisis gets so much worse, with an increased burden placed on lower income people and communities of color. And many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was an already untenable situation. But at the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed. And as a result, the pandemic really has the potential to even further exacerbate some of the inequality in our region that we've been seeing for years now. Because of our affordability crisis, communities are frustrated, and it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've kind of been able to see both sides of the coin. I have friends and family who are worried about the changes they're seeing in their communities and what that means for them, for their families, for their housing situations. But I also have friends and family who have pursued jobs within the tech industry and have found lots of success for themselves and for their families alike. However, we see that when tech shoulders the blame for our region's issues, it starts to create an us versus them dynamic that's further dividing our communities. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help, but they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide. While we're all unsure as to how long we'll be managing this new normal caused by the pandemic, it's important to know, as I mentioned earlier, that many within the tech industry have remained relatively unscathed. And more than most other sectors, tech has been able to make the transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. And we have our opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to support our neighbors, but it can be hard to know how to best engage in times of such uncertainty. So this chart is showing us the state of our affordability crisis in the Bay Area. I think the fact that rents are rising throughout the years isn't really a surprise to anyone on this call because we already know, we feel this, we've heard about this from friends and family. And while some Californians are very successful in the tech-driven economy here, the average salaries have for tenants have actually decreased slightly. So we're showing stats for California because that's where we're based as an organization, and it's where tech is headquartered. But a version of this story is playing out all across the country. And it's really a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success, and without tech at the table to work together to address this shared crisis, it's understandable as to why community members are frustrated, like we just talked about. And this chart is showing us the unemployment rate in California throughout the last couple of years. So before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering just around 4%, and people were already struggling to make ends meet. And when the virus hit, unemployment claims spiked to 16%, which is that huge spike on the right side of the chart. And that was a more dramatic spike than our last recession we had around 2008. So in the span of 1 month, we lost decades worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or worse. So at TechEquity Collaborative, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone. But it's clear that it won't happen on its own. We have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities. We have to show up, and we have to do so in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. At TechEquity Collaborative, we believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to issues where they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in our communities. And we know we can do this, and the first step is to show up. And you all have done a great first step by signing on to this webinar, joining in on the discussion, and really trying to understand the root causes of the inequities we're seeing all around us. Our goal at TechEquity is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. So we believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. We help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in system change in three major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live. And we do this through a variety of strategies, but some examples are book club discussions with authors, panel discussions with experts in housing and labor fields, webinars such as these, voter guides we produce around election season, and much more. We also advocate for public policy that rebalances power and builds economic equity. And a perfect example of this is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which together with tons of other organizations and legislators, we helped pass a law in 2019 that would protect 8 million California renters, preventing unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. And finally, there's corporate practice, aiming to turn companies into agents of equity in the broader community. So we have corporate partnerships and corporate engagements. And as we mentioned, tech workers have outsized political power that is largely untapped to when it comes to public policy advocacy. So connecting tech workers to outside perspectives builds more empathy and ethical practice in our workplaces, in our products that we're building, and our surrounding communities. So at TechEquity Collaborative, our two issue areas are housing and workforce and labor. Now you might be asking yourselves, why this? Well, while housing costs are a core part of this, these two issues really are intertwined and intersect in a variety of ways, because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. So our goal is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, but we're all well positioned to adapt our agendas to these new realities. And while the pandemic has exposed the cracks of our economy, these underlying issues have always existed in our economy for decades. So let's learn a little bit more about inequity within our neighborhoods. The affordability crisis really is decades in the making, and the policy choices we've made over the course of decades have set us up for this level of pain our community is feeling now, especially during the pandemic. So, in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color and in the Bay Area in California and all across the country. And that policy is redlining. So, redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. So, this policy is so named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. And on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined. So, as you can see with the image on the screen, that would be all those little red blocks on the map of San Francisco. And those communities that were deemed risky investments or redlined didn't receive any investment at all. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color, and that really is by no accident. Their hazardous rating was in large part based on racial demographics. So, in other words, redlining was a discriminatory and a racist policy. It made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. And there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. The crisis we're living in is decades in the making, way before tech, as we said, and it's not unique to the Bay Area. It extends across California and all across the country. So these are examples of redline neighborhoods in Austin and Atlanta, two tech hubs that are popping up slowly throughout the years. So by preventing entire neighborhoods from being able to access this capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools they needed, small businesses, and a community that fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who lived in red line neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now you may be asking yourselves, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock. And an income shock could be something like a sudden huge rent increase, you lose your job, your car breaks down, things like that. And it impacts almost 1 out of 2 Californians. So 46% of Californians are in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates. So 67% of Latino households are in liquid asset poverty, and 63% of African American households are in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why this is happening, but as we talked about, many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions have often predated tech's arrival, but tech workers can now take a better role in supporting better policies moving forward. So the twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing and wages that don't cover the cost of living, have created a regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcome of the pandemic. So many people in our communities were already struggling. And with unemployment on a steep rise and city and state budgets that are being depleted by emergency response efforts, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement solutions now. As we can see, the hourly pay for workers has not increased much throughout the last couple of decades, and even though productivity has dramatically increased. So, according to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers covered by a collective bargaining agreement from dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019. So what does that mean? That means that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. So the cost of living here were already high. Let's take a look at what a worker earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it takes to afford an average two-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. So if you're making $133,000 a year, you can afford the average two-bedroom working a regular 8-hour day, so a regular shift, right? However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford that two-bedroom. Again, if you're making minimum wage, you need to work 40 hours a day to comfortably afford living in a two-bedroom apartment in the same city where you work. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're setting up an impossible situation for low wage workers to be able to afford living in the city. And this problem persists across the country. So even though costs in burgeoning tech cities like Austin, Denver, and Atlanta aren't as high as the Bay Area and as San Francisco, the cost of living is still unreasonable for anyone earning minimum wage. And in San Francisco, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford the city. There's this common misconception that all tech workers are paid lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making six figures. So some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success or marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, cooks, bus drivers who are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to afford that apartment, right? But why is the apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due in part to lack of supply. And this chart is showing us what we should be building. So the state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build in order to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA, which stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job at meeting our RHNA goals for the above moderate income housing. That's that big bracket you see on the right side of the screen. And that's affordable to people making that good salary we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough housing for lower and moderate income people. But those are the brackets on the left side of the screen. So as housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from our region altogether. So remember when someone tells you that we just need to build more housing, it's important that you ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. And because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our community while folks with higher income are coming in and staying in. So for every high income person coming into the Bay Area, a low income person is being pushed out at about a 1-to-1 ratio. So displacement is driven by policy choices, and we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress. And the folks who are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs are getting hit the hardest by this crisis. And as you can see, this chart is from 2016, so we don't yet fully know the extent, the impact of the pandemic will have on displacement in the Bay Area and across the state. And we can't just build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. The good news is that members at TechEquity are showing up for the community. Tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working together alongside non-tech community members. We can advocate for solutions together to our most pressing shared problems. And we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are driving inequity within our tech economy. So, as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living out today is the result of years and years of bad policy choices. But the good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. At TechEquity Collaborative, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone, and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities better places to live. So we've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but we won't be able to achieve this without the necessary policy changes. So here's what we've identified in the housing world. We need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis, and that starts with the three Ps. So production, building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability, like we just talked about. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of constructing housing by removing delays and lengthy administrative processes that make it too expensive to build homes. Preservation, making sure that we are providing more resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing. Protection, we need to protect existing tenants from displacement. So it's going to take a long time and a while to build the housing that we need, but in the meantime, we need to protect existing tenants from being displaced. Racial equity. Racism is embedded in our economic, political, and social systems. It's embedded in us all, and especially within housing. So that means that we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are upheld in housing. So we have to craft policy solutions that are building racial equity in response. And especially now, we need to be thinking about short-term and long-term solutions to preservation and protection. Many of our neighbors are more at risk than ever as a result of the pandemic. We also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. We want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities they exist within, that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits regardless of the role they're in. So we need to make sure that all workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse, and contracted workers. So, in partnership with Silicon Valley Rising, we created a standard that tech companies should implement for contract workers, which includes creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, making sure the workplace is safe, and ensuring that there is fair scheduling. We need to expand and equip the workforce. Training as a standalone approach will not lead us out of inequality and not guarantee employment for displaced workers. And in order to solve this crisis, we must undertake multiple strategies, massive job programs, high labor standards and protections for all jobs, and innovative recruitment, training, and development of new and diverse talent. At the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. Last, we need to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met. We need a new social contract that ensures that everyone has the basics to survive. We must strengthen our social safety net so that no one falls through the cracks. So once again, there are tons of ways for you to get involved with our organization. We host tons of educational events. So we have one event coming up on how NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, silence workers in tech and beyond. And I'll be talking about that event in a little bit. If you're interested in public policy, you can check out our priority legislation that we're organizing our membership around, including a rental registry, extending paid family leave, and more information on that will be in the next slides. For corporate practice, we offer a wide range of services to companies and provide ways for them to get more involved on these issues, from employee engagement to policy advising. So we'll be sending out a follow-up email after this with links to some of the things I mentioned. And if you're interested in any of these, just reply back to me and I'll point you in the right direction. So this is how we work. We try to make it as accessible and as easy as possible to plug in, but making sure that we're all building community in the process of the work that we're doing. So this year, we're excited to continue our work in the housing and labor spaces through creating ethical work practices in tech, tackling algorithmic bias in housing that's further driving inequality and upholding systemic racism in the housing market, and crucial housing policies that are protecting and bringing relief to our most vulnerable communities. So what can you do today? You can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work and share who we are as an organization. You can support us financially by becoming a member for $10 a month or $100 a year. Or you can take action with us by supporting some of our priority legislation, which I'll be talking about next. So the first one we have is rental registry. So TechEquity is committed to getting better data about our housing market. And better data means that we can build more accurate policy interventions and ensure help is being targeted to people who need it most. So TechEquity is working on a number of campaigns to get better data on housing and ensure that data is being used fairly through our rent registry and algorithmic bias in housing initiatives. So this year we ran a bill, AB 1188, that unfortunately stalled out in the legislative process this year. But we plan to continue to pursue establishing a rent registry and make sure you subscribe to our newsletter, join our Slack to stay updated on the progress of our work. You can also take action on various other pieces of legislation that relate to our core issues of housing and workforce and labor. So we've decided to focus our advocacy on these bills because they will do the most to ensure an affordable home, a family sustaining job, and a true safety net are available for all Californians. So if you'd like more information on these bills, I'll be including links so that you can have more information and sign on as community endorsers and maybe help out in other ways. For upcoming events, we have one event coming up which you can register for in about 2 weeks. So that event is called Non-Disclosure, Non-Exposure, How NDAs Silence Workers in Tech and Beyond. And we'll discuss how NDAs have become gag orders for workers, how the bill SB 331 can free workers to share their stories and change the game for tech and beyond. So this one will be on Tuesday, July 27th from 12 to 1. It will be a panel discussion. You can get your tickets. It's free. Bring a friend. Once again, that's Tuesday, July 27th. And I'll also be sending out a link in the follow-up email for this event. So as I mentioned, you can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can become a member for $10 a month or $100 a year and support us financially. Or you can take action with us on a wide range of volunteer opportunities. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information to absorb. So if you have any questions, I'll be taking questions right now. As I mentioned, there will be a follow-up email going out to everyone. It'll include the slides, it'll include a recording of the webinar, and it'll include a couple of links. And you can also respond back to that email with questions if you have any. So I'll just take a moment. But if you don't have any questions, like I said, just respond back to the email and I can answer personally as well. Cool. So I'm not seeing anything. So we're going to wrap up right there. I want to thank everyone for your time. We hope you feel inspired to join our growing movement. As I mentioned, we'll be sending out a follow-up email. There's always tons of ways to get involved. So reach out back to me on that email. Thank you for your time and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.